Hi everyone and welcome to our talk this evening. I feel like I need to make some in-depth introduction. Thank you for the introduction, Beat. But I must insist on introducing Professor Gilroy a little more. Paul Gilroy is one of the most distinguished scholars and cultural theorists of our time, and is known for his significant contributions to the exploration of race, racism, and the Black Atlantic. He is the founder of the University College London Centre for Study of Race and Racism. He has held prestigious academic positions at Yale University, the London School of Economics, and King's College London. In 2019, he was awarded the prestigious Holberg Prize for his outstanding contributions to research in the humanities and social sciences. His influential works, such as The Black Atlantic, Between Camps, Post-Colonial Melancholia, There Ain't No Black in the Union Jack, I really do like the title of that, and After Empire, Against Race, Black Britain, A Photographic History, amongst others, have profoundly shaped interdisciplinary views on modernity, Afro-modernity, and the diasporic culture. What joy and profound honor to have you here with us, Professor Gilroy. Your body of work has a transformative impact, not just within academia, but also in lived experiences, and continues to influence public discourses such as this on race, culture, and modernity. Thank you for being here.
Well, thank you very much indeed for such a generous introduction. I'm grateful to you. It's an honor for me to be here, although I'm always a little bit uncomfortable when Steve's not here, because this isn't my work, so although I've had a certain involvement in some of it, since I first met him in the 1990s, there's been a conversation, but this is his stuff. And also you've made a second rule this evening, which is that we can't have any spoilers. Okay, so it's going to be a strange conversation without the spoilers and without him to represent his ideas.
Absolutely. Thank you so much to everyone for coming too, because today we're putting the cart before the horse. And we hope that for those of you who haven't seen it, we wouldn't spoil it too much. But as Beat said, tonight we'll be talking about Mangrove Small Axe. It's the first of the 5 films in a series, in an anthology called Small Axe, and we'll do our most not to disclose too much. So, Paul, in a previous interview, you stated that Mangrove aims to provide a historical transfusion that in today's context can present younger and mainstream audiences with an alternative perspective on Britain's history over the past 50 years. And in Steve McQueen's words, the film is a love letter to Black resilience, triumph, hope, music, joy, love, as well as friendship and family, and of course, food. What specific events served as inspiration for the film, especially as you were in conversation with Steve over the years?
Well, for me, it's essential that anyone looking at this history through this film understands 2 or 3 things about it. Firstly, it's governed by Steve's desire to encourage, to facilitate, to promote intergenerational conversation about the history of settlement, black settlement in Britain. And I think this isn't a spoiler. I know that when the series ran on the BBC, he had fought very hard to have it shown at prime time on consecutive days. And what that meant was that people gathered in, I can't exactly recall where we were in the unfolding pandemic at this point, but that's another factor in bringing people together. So what you found was a lot of watching parties, people joining together with their kin across the generations to watch this history. So that's the first thing. It's an infusion of history, but it's also about creating and promoting a dialogue across the generations. And I think and I guess I, in different ways, feel that's really important right now. It's really important right now. And it calls for a lot of patience, a lot of generosity, a lot of attentiveness, and actually a lot of translation, because the different generations don't use the same language in the same way. They don't have the same technological or cultural points of reference and contact. So there's a lot of work that has to go on to have a conversation about the past in good faith. The second thing I want to say about it is that I think one of the ways that racism works in our world is it doesn't let you, it cuts off your relationship with history in a radical way. Lots of people in the black radical tradition in different locations down the centuries actually have felt that there's a kind of blocked access to the past that we need. People write that history and bring it alive. But the other thing that racism does very strongly in our world, I'm not saying it's necessarily the same anywhere else, is that it doesn't let you imagine a future. It makes it hard to imagine a future. And there are, in the cultures that people have created, strong efforts to imagine the future with reference to the past. And I think that is one of the things that these series of films tries to do. Lastly, and this isn't a spoiler, one of the ways that racism has operated in many different locations, the forms of power and hierarchy it creates, flow through the law. In Caribbean culture, in Ethiopianist culture, in Rastafari, in all of these currents of resistance that we've seen across the centuries, there's a strong engagement with law. Because people don't like law which is partial. People don't like law which is tainted by its attachment to seeing the world in black and white only. So I think in popular culture, in poetry, in literature, and in music too, there's a very, very strong sensitivity to the way the law cuts into the world we know and organizes it into a particular form of hierarchy. So I think that engagement with the law, that demand for a different law, that demand for a better law, is at the heart of the culture of resistance that we made in my country and elsewhere. I think I can say that I don't speak for anyone else. And that too is affirmed, is celebrated in this film you're going to see this evening.
Well, thank you. In the film, as well as historical records of events, the reality of this kind of bias, this kind of racial bias, and as you kind of phrase it in one of your earlier essays on the myth of black criminality, which suggests that the statistical disparities in recorded criminality among specific groups stem from police stereotyping and racist labeling, where the boundaries of what is considered criminal or illegal are elastic, and the limits of the law, as you just rightly said, are repeatedly altered by intense class conflict. I kind of find the events in the mangrove, as commentaries not only to historical events, but to very current ones too. And rewatching the film recently it kind of resonated with recent events here in Switzerland. For the first time, a culture of discrimination and systemic racism has been revealed within the Swiss police force in Lausanne, where 4 officers were suspended for sharing racist messages in their private WhatsApp group. And this incident took place only a few weeks ago amidst ongoing protests and racial profiling. So thinking about history, has time marked this discourse as a persistent issue ingrained in humanity, because events like this wouldn't allow one the luxury to think otherwise.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned this development, this recent development, in the notes that you sent me. I was thinking about that because, of course, the other context of Steve's intervention with these films is the American Summer of 2020, and a new, perhaps in the global sense, sensitivity to the importance of these things. These are not marginal questions. These are not questions which are to do only with their victims. You know, when the statue went into the harbour in Bristol, when people in Greenland and Iceland were dipping the hands of colonialists and the statues in their environments in red paint, it was clear that this was something that resonated. It resonated across the world. So I think these questions of policing, of violence, of not the individual actually necessarily, but the institutional character of these recurrent patterns. I mean, in a way I'm sort of relieved because our country is terribly stuck. Its problems relate to being absolutely stuck and unable to break free from the pathologies of colonial fantasies and these other things I've written about. But it was in a way encouraging to see not only that these events around policing, the crisis really of a kind of legitimacy with regard to policing, so vividly transmitted through the new technologies that people have now, the way in which these events, traumatic events, can be transmitted instantly, enormous distances, in ways that it isn't always easy to even reconstruct, actually, especially now that the technology companies have shut down their API, so you can't track what's going on with these messages as they travel in the way that we could maybe 10 years ago. So I think these are global problems, and from my perspective, I'd say they're intrinsic to the world of policing, to the world of prisons, to the kind of assumptions of those who govern about the law and the way it should operate in practice. And that means that not only that there'll be individual police officers who maybe have neo-fascist attachments or political projects where they think that black people are a lower form of life, that brown people don't belong, or whatever it is. There may be individual police officers like that, but that isn't the issue that's fundamental. What's fundamental is the systemic character of these outcomes, the fact that they are everywhere, and that they do resonate not just with class questions, as you said, but with questions of white supremacy, with questions of gender hierarchy, all kinds of I don't even know what to call them, wrongs. Let's call them wrongs. All kinds of wrongs connected together, really, in the practical way these institutions function. And you know, the law is an instrument. You want the law applied to this, and the law, as you will see later, and as you may know from your life experience anyway, doesn't always work in the way that it says it's going to work. Once it's shone into these institutional problems, it falls short.
And in the preface to Black Britain, Stuart Hall poses the question, why do black communities awaken such hostility? I wonder if that is too rhetorical to even attempt an answer now to that.
Yeah, I think that's too big a question, because I mean, I know that we have to ask that question, but I think the danger of asking that question at that altitude is that you produce an answer which is too simple. Mm-hmm. And actually, one of the things that I would like to do is to find more complex answers, but not be defeated or inhibited by that complexity. So let's say, I know that Switzerland has never had anything to do with colonial power in the world, of course. But let's say that there was a country like my own, which can't deny its relationship to that colonial history, to that bloody history, to centuries of trading in human beings, centuries of slaughtering people in different parts of the world, which were all part of that. When you have a situation like that, you have to account for contemporary problems in relation to that disavowed history of empire. Stuart Hall was my teacher. That's why he wrote the forward to this book. And one thing he said frequently, I don't know if this is something that may help you to understand where we are in the history of colonial. I was just in Brussels last week doing some work there. So I'm doing a kind of tour of Europe's chocolate capitals. And of course the question of sugar, the question of cocoa, the question of tea, the question of coffee. And we are, Stuart would say, we're the sugar in all of those bitter substances that made industrial work possible. We're the empty calories that made that work possible. So that is always, I think, a living material symbol for me of the deep way in which we're part of the making of modern Europe.
Would like to know more about your project on chocolate capitals. Yeah. But talking about Switzerland's role in maybe colonialism, I would like to say that in trickles it's beginning to own up to being implicitly involved in different forms of colonial endeavors. And talking about how time has revealed things, I quite like the idea of the changing same. It's a concept you use in the Black Atlantic, and Amiri Baraka also uses the same concept to emphasize the idea that while some aspects of life and culture may appear to progress, the core structures of systemic oppression, such as racial injustice, remain constant, a condition that the Black diaspora contends with amidst what you refer to as the tumultuous, contradictory processes of settlement. So what I'd like to ask is, when does a Black diasporic community settle?
Well, I would say that it settles when it inhabits a relationship to, if we're talking about an African diaspora, where it inhabits a relationship to its African past which is not reversible, which is not, you can't rewind the tape, if you know what a tape is. We used to rewind tapes, So you can't rewind the tape of culture and go back to the place of origin. So I would say that, for me, is critical for the idea of settlement. And settlement, would be an ambivalent process, because you might accept that you're dwelling, in the place. My mother came from Guyana in the 1950s to be a teacher in London. And I think until her death, she still called Guyana home, even though she never went there because she didn't want to have to deal with her relatives, you know what I mean? So I think there's an ambivalent, Stuart too, I think, considered himself an exile, like Edward Said did. And Edward Said was someone who has a very strong set of arguments about diasporic life, about life in exile. And I think our generation, my generation, my friend Linton Kwesi Johnson, he calls our parents, the so-called Windrush generation, he calls them the heroic generation. And he calls us, and this may be on your mind when you're watching the film later, he calls us the rebel generation. And I don't yet know what to call the next lot. I tend to call them the anxious generation, but they don't like that, and I'm sure they'll find a better name for themselves than the label I want to pin on them. So I would say that dwelling, as opposed to sojourning, that was the old word when you went temporarily somewhere, dwelling, and yet I would say that our settlement, I'm making it sound as though I'm settled in and my, I'm English and all this kind of thing. But I think I would say my whole life, from the very moment that I was aware of hearing adults talking or looking at the city where I grew up, which is London, people were saying, "Go back to your own country." So that in a way, obviously we're at home and obviously we're part of the way things work. But there is always a sense that someone somewhere is thinking that we don't belong here, that we aren't seen to belong. And I think if you saw the demonstration a couple of weeks ago with all the flags and so on, I don't know about all those people, but some of them think that in order to be English, I'm sure you don't have anyone like that in Switzerland. In order to be English, you have to be white. And I know that there are people like this all across Europe in the different places that I've been. But I'm sure you've done much better than that. So perhaps you could pass on the recipe for that to others elsewhere.
Well, thank you. Shall we talk about music?
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned the changing same already.
Yes.
And for me, the changing same, I mean, I was very much drawn to Baraka because he was one of the first people to really write about music in a way that was life-changing for me. And one of the other people who's, when I went to university, it wasn't possible to do black studies or anything like that. But where I went to university, I started working with my tutor, and I told him about what I cared about. And he said, I just supervised a PhD of this guy. And it turned out to be a man called Ben Sidran, who was a pianist who played with the Rolling Stones and Steve Miller Band, and he's still a gigging musician, actually. And he wrote one of the earliest cultural histories of jazz music. And Baraka was someone who, I guess, gave him a box to stand on so he could do his work. And Baraka was someone who really changed my way of thinking about culture in general, I guess I'd say. So the idea of the changing same isn't just about patterns of resistance or patterns of culture that have been mobile and drifted from one place, or been carried, in people's heads from one place to another, and then take on a new aspect in a different environment. It's also about how the culture functions. We mix and we remix, we version and we version. People play standards and they know the changes, but they fill that standard with themselves. So in all of these instances, in different parts of the African diaspora into the Western Hemisphere that we can look, we find this sort of productive recycling, let's call it that. Productive recycling. So, or a recycling. Recycling doesn't quite capture, because the change part is the dominant part. It's more like a circular economy or some of these other things that we haven't quite got to, that we're reaching for right now. So I think we find that as a motif everywhere. And in some places it's very formalized, like with the jazz world of standards and playing. People know, they learn them, but they don't leave them as they find them. They make them again each time they're performed. They're different. And of course, in the Caribbean context, there's a whole culture of how that versioning process works, which was connected to the fact that it was cheaper to take one rhythm and use it 20 times, and get different performers and artists to use that same rhythm, but is also something more than that, in my view. Because, if you start to go on a kind of version excursion, you can see what's being added with each subsequent iteration.
But the most fascinating part about the changing same is that there's something of the original that's constant, that remains, that's recognizable.
Yeah. But it's always hard to find it. You have to look for it, or listen for it, or watch for it. It doesn't announce itself.
I actually got an excerpt from the Black Atlantic on the changing same, for those of you who would like to know more about what we're talking about, and I'll read it. On the most elementary level, these plural forms make the abstract concept of a changing same a living, familiar reality. The relationship of the listener to the text is changed by the proliferation of different versions. Which one is the original? how does the memory of one version transform the way in which subsequent versions are heard and understood? The components of one mix, separated and broken down, can be more easily borrowed and blended to create further permutations of meaning. End of quote. And I think this applies to many other things. I mean, you talk about the Black Atlantic as a sphere of intermixtures. I see the change in same working there as well in terms of different practices that are rehearsed over the years, and there are quite a number of add-ons that come onto it, but there's just something of an original that remains. Think of Carnival, for instance, and the elements that are added on and how they evolve over time. And which brings me back to music as a very, very powerful memory cue that evokes related memories, feelings, and even visual images from particular moments in one's life. And music really does shape the Small Act series. I mean, the soundtrack of Mangrove features a blend of reggae, soul, pop, and sort of designed to reflect the genuine atmosphere of time and the experience of the characters, and ours as well.
I mean, Jim Reeves, don't forget Jim.
Yeah, I was surprised to have Jim Reeves on there, and after the toots and the maytals.
I was surprised about Jim Reeves. I mean, Caribbean people, I think I can say West Africans too, love country music. I mean, that's why, you know, when King Sunny Ade had his band, he had a pedal steel guitar player in the band for a long time.
Yeah.
So people love country music. But I mean, I struggle with Jim Reeves, actually, I have to admit. Jim Reeves, in the sort of working class life of Black London in the 50s and 60s, the Irish and the Caribbean people were often very bonded by Jim Reeves. He was a kind of hinge between their worlds. And in a way, I mean, I've never been vulnerable to what Jim Reeves does. I mean, I know that there's no music that's so bad that you can't learn something from it. But I do wonder about it. Jim Reeves, you know, he made 2 albums of country music in Afrikaans in South Africa. So this gives you an idea of what's going on in his head.
But have you, well, you might want to listen to some Jim Reeves to sort of understand what we're talking about here.
I'm sorry. Do you want to play some Jim Reeves? I didn't bring any.
Well, the Small Act itself, the title of the series is also a song on the Burnin' album by the Wailers. And the track goes, if you are the big tree, we're the small axe, sharpened to cut you down, ready to cut you down. And the song highlights that even the tiniest individual or group, when united, can bring about substantial change and justice in the face of larger or more powerful adversaries. But the term small axe also represents this strength. I think I read somewhere where Steve was saying it was from an African proverb, where collective power and fight against oppression with a small axe works when used persistently, could be effective in cutting down dominant big trees. And in Steve McQueen's words, he says, us as a community, us together, we could do anything, we could shift anything. But analyzing this further in understanding the dynamics of power in societies, I think about the collective power versus the distributive power. And I think having the wand of authority that comes with distributive power always seems too far-flung. Or what's your take on this?
With regard to small acts, I mean, the proverb thing probably is true. When the first version of Small Axe was cut by the Wailers with Lee Perry, the Swiss resident, funnily enough. I don't know if anyone's seen him around before. He's passed on, but when he was living in Neuchâtel, he must have been part of your public world to some degree. So he produced the original version of that when they were working with him in his studio, the Black Ark it was called. Studio. It was a very interesting sound that that studio had because he used, and he had a 4-track, but he invented a whole sort of particular signature of dub, a sonic signature that came from using his particular kind of equipment. And the other dimension to the proverb, which probably doesn't fit so well with Steve's story, but fits with my own, is that Lee Perry's studio, the Black Ark, was set up in opposition to 3 other studios, Channel 1, Studio 1, and Treasure House on your Pottinger, maybe? 3 studios anyway. So to cut you down was also announcing that the independent, very modernistic sound of the Black Ark studio was going to defeat the 3 other studios which were dominating the world of reggae at that time. So I know that may sound a bit parochial, but I do want that in the mix of different shades, different colours that come to bear on this symbol of the small act.
And talking about your knowledge with music and the music and expressions of the Black diaspora, I share a curiosity which I believe our audience also has regarding your engagement with music and its interplay with your academic endeavors and personal experiences. As a musician and a DJ who has engaged with these cultures and previously contributed to The Wire, where you explored jazz, funk, and fusion music in the early 1990s. Could you provide further insights into your relationship with these art forms?
I'm a failed musician, and when I realised I was the worst person in the band, I turned to be more serious about my academic work, because I like playing music, I love to play music, and I love to play, but if you play with great musicians, it's something that elevates you, you know? And I was very fortunate through my early part of my life to play with really fantastic musicians. People who are still earning a living in music, which is astonishing these days, given that music is judged to be something which is given away for free by corporate interests which have no sensitivity to its place in the lives of, in the everyday lives of black communities across the world. So yeah, I'm just another failed musician really, and that's why what I began to do alongside playing, as I played less and mostly having a full-time job and writing, I couldn't get into being an academic when I started. I was really locked out of academic life because people didn't like what I said and didn't like what I represented. So I began to write about music a lot. Write in papers, write in magazines when we had those kinds of print culture, and I would go and interview people I looked up to, mostly in literature or in music, try and talk to them about their experiences, and I would review records and things like that, and that gave me a kind of it gave me another thing to do. And while I was wondering about whether I'd be able to go to the places that my PhD was supposed to take me, and so what can I say about that? I'll say one thing, that my work really isn't my work. What it is my translation of things that I found in the musical life of black communities across this diaspora you've been talking about. And what I did was I took many of the feelings and motifs and the poetry, the rhetoric, the inspiration from improvising and playing sounds and all of these things, and I sort of folded them into my discourse and took that energy and gave it a different flavor. That's all. I didn't invent anything. I just took those things and changed them in my articulation of them.
Well, we're very thankful to be recipients of these articulations and translations, and if it does help, you'll be our forever rock star academic.
Forever. I am mortal. I am actually mortal, so not forever, no.
Well.
For a while.
Before we open up to the audience, I'd like to ask you about the notion of infrahumanity. It's something I work with closely, and I try to relate it to the film, because with their as you will experience, there's an empathic transportation that immerses one deeply into the mangrove, the film you're about to see, where emotions are heightened, leading to both cognitive and emotional empathy, conditions that fundamentally shape our configurations as humans. In your Holberg lecture titled Never Again, Refusing Race and Salvaging the Human, you express a hopeful vision of a defiant humanism. In an earlier Tanner lecture, Suffering and Infrahumanity in Yale, you spoke of, and I quote, an open-ended inquiry into the nature, capacity, and potential of the human, which has long been judged central to the mission of the academic humanities. If we want to sustain, modify, and perhaps even renew the educational project in the face of its contemporary debasement and undoing, we remain obliged to investigate where the human broke down. Considered human never required scrutiny, or who is human? Who qualifies to be human?
Well, you've asked me a lifetime's worth of questions there, and you're right in the sense that you caught me out trying to be hopeful, because actually I'm cosmically pessimistic about things. So I really appreciate the fact you caught me out when I was trying to find positive things to say, because I think in the context of the climate crisis, right, which we're in, who's going to be recognised as human and who counts as an authentic or a worthwhile form of life is going to be greatly, in contest. It's going to be negotiated, and it's already being negotiated, as you know, via the crisis in the Mediterranean and the crisis in the Manche. And this is something that the colonial mentalities have always done. You're absolutely right to say that. And many groups of human beings, not just colonial human beings, see the people on the other side of the valley as insect life. So we have a lot of work to do. I think where this question bears on the film that we're going to see tonight, I would say that it bears on it in the way about really the question is who is recognizable as a subject of the law. In my country, we're not citizens in the way that you are here. You're citizens. If you're lucky enough to be a citizen, I know there's a certain, tension. There's policing around that line of citizenship. Well, we don't even get that line. We're subjects of the crown, is what we are. So the question is, when we go to I know it's funny, but actually, it's not so funny when you're on the end of the receiving end of it, right? Okay. So when you go to the court, either as someone who's in the dock, who's been accused of a crime, or as a witness, or as a victim, you want to be recognized within the moral and political architecture of the institution as a human being, invested, if you're lucky, with some rights that enforce that mode of recognition. And of course, the racial orders, wherever they are, have always denied that. They've always refused that possibility. And people have fought very hard, very long, to be recognized as human beings. And African American intellectuals who led that conversation for a long time are very divided about that. W.B. Du Bois, very famous polyglot, polymath, he said that there was a third thing. He used the Latin phrase, tertium quid, because he was struggling with how to name this problem. There's a third thing between a human being and a brute, between a human being and an animal, and that third thing is in his language, the Negro, right? And that idea was institutionalized in the United States for a long period of time. Someone like I worked a lot with Richard Wright, the writer from Mississippi who went to live in Paris and moved his intellectual life and his political life to Paris. And he says, we don't want art that begs the question of black humanity. I think why would we limit ourselves to fighting over the idea that we're actually really human? I mean, Frederick Douglass even said that in the 19th century. He said, you know, it's beneath my dignity to start trying to persuade you I'm a human being. You know, he says, look at the laws they have in the slave states. Do they forbid dogs from doing these things? No, of course not. The only people who are forbidden from doing this whole cast of criminal acts are actually black people. So we know that they're secretly recognized as human, even if that isn't announced in the way that this system, this institutionalized system of discrimination functions. So these ideas have a long history. People have been quarreling productively and unproductively about these ideas for a very long time. And the reason I wrote the things you're quoting at me is because I think that people who sit in campuses with tenure and are protected by those institutions, although they're going to discover shortly how thin that crust of protection actually is, put that over the other side, shouldn't really be going around saying that being human is nothing, and that really there's a sort of fashion, you know, now to try to pretend that the very idea of seeking that recognition is somehow a bigger problem, I guess, than I think it is, because I think we need that recognition. When you're in the water and someone reaches to pull you out of the water onto a boat, you know, and they feel the weight of your body coming out of the water, you know, your humanity is actually being negotiated in that gesture. And I think that's important. I think that's really important. And it can't be just brushed away as if it was an irrelevance. When the police are beating you, you know, in a way that they wouldn't beat a different kind of body that they think is a properly human body, then that matters to you where that boundary falls. And to have a world of ideas which doesn't let that problem breathe, is a mistake, I guess. So the things you quoted are just me trying to point that out.
Thank you. And Beat, we have time for 5 questions. Oh, okay, all right. So we'll open up and take about 5 questions and then come back to finish off.
You can keep going.
On negotiating humanity. There's a line, the only spoiler from the film that you'll get tonight. A line from the film that says, "We might have won the battle, Frank, but we'll see about the war." I'm thinking about the state of affairs now. Isn't history vehemently refusing to be history? Isn't humanity blindly imitating its past as
Well, that's a big question, because, you know, the last 2 years we've seen all the institutions that govern human rights in the world being shredded in front of our eyes in real time. So, you know, by that light, yes, I guess, you know, what's happening to the Palestinians isn't just happening to the Palestinians, it's happening to all of us. Because if that history of intervention, that legal architecture, that juridical structure, you know, flawed though it may have been, you know, is now going to be swept away, they're only the first victims of the problems that are coming. So I guess if that's what you were pointing to, then I agree with you.
questions?
Hi. So I was surprised that you said that you're cosmically pessimistic. I can understand why, because the weight of the world is really heavy at the moment, as you said, what's happening. But when I read your work, I read a lot of optimism in it and a lot of hope. You know, hope is the last to die. Do you think that that's a good thing to take from your writing? Hope and optimism and a different way to look at things?
Yeah, when I said cosmically pessimistic, I didn't mean politically pessimistic necessarily. I'm not sure political pessimism, that's a luxury we can't really afford right now. So I guess when I say cosmically pessimistic, I'm thinking really about the context of climate change and that climate crisis that's engulfing us. You know, I mean, with fires, with droughts. I mean, the reason I was late tonight was because of this massive storm that's blown across. And you know, I don't know how closely you follow these questions, but you know, the weather is changing. Let me tell you that. I'm a birder. I go and look at birds and I follow birds, and I'm interested in what birds and their movements and their distribution tell us about ourselves, but also about the way our world is changing. So I think we, you know, yes, we don't have much time. We don't have much time. I'm not one of those people that thinks that we have no time, but we don't have much time. So that requires hope, it requires vision, it requires energy, it requires resilience, which is a word that they've taken away from us. We want that word back. We want the word resilience back. I've been very influenced in my life, not just by black thinkers in the world, but by some other sort of people whose work I really like and admire. And one of them was the Italian poet and philosopher Giacomo Leopardi, who I think in the end died of eating too much ice cream, but lived much of his life on the slopes of Vesuvius. So he lived on the slopes of Vesuvius. I'm sure many of you who are Italian speakers will know the poetry of Leopardi. And he writes at the end of his life about living in this very inhospitable environment. And he's very struck and excited by the plants that can grow in this volcanic. It's not just the idea that the volcano could explode at any moment. It's also that the conditions of soil, the climatic conditions of water and soil and the chemistry of that environment is not hospitable to every plant. And one of his most famous poems is about the broom, La Ginestra, this plant which is able to thrive in this very inhospitable environment. So I think there are different ways of thinking about pessimism and thinking about optimism. And also, you know, I don't. If you look at the mental health struggles of very creative people, a lot of musicians struggle with their mental health, and it's to do with their creativity in some really profound and interesting way. And so I think, you know, those vulnerabilities are really important, but so is the sort of effort that we have to find to produce creative ways of thinking about how to manage in inhospitable environments. And the traditions of the Black radical tradition, the Black Atlantic tradition, are full of illustrations of how people manage to more than survive, actually, in the most inhospitable of environments. And perhaps the film you're going to see tonight, in a small way, illustrates some of that dynamic.
Hello, really nice to meet you. I have a question regarding humanity, and I was really interested in what does being human mean to you?
Oh, another high altitude question. I think it means what being human means. It means it's an ultimate plasticity. It doesn't mean any one thing, but actually, if you like, for me, human nature is the ability to change and do a whole infinite range of, not infinite, almost apparently infinite things which you can do, and to be able to adapt and function and do all those different things. So humanity, humanness is about that incredible capacity to change and morph into all these other things that are extraordinary. And so I don't think there are many other forms of life that have that attribute. Some do, some don't. But we, if I may say, I've never said we meant all humankind before. But I think, you know, the kind of, as it were, the planetary consciousness that we need to cultivate now requires a bit more boldness about using those pronouns. and so I'm going to say, yeah, we can do all kinds of stuff, and we are pliable, plastic. We are plastic creatures, and that is the signature of our particularity. That's not too posh a way of putting it. So yeah, we can do lots of stuff.
Hi. You mentioned generations before. What is your message to the next generation?
Watch out, pay attention, and get off your phone, please.
Okay.
Just experiment with getting off your phone for a bit. See how that feels. Yeah.
I refer to the political developments in the last 2 years that you also were talking about. And for me, the kind of background interest for the film that we are going to see, I have no idea if it will, but it is what to learn, what to understand about resistance movements and how people can maybe, what you mentioned also, together be an axe to cut the big tree. What do you observe right now in terms of resistance in Great Britain? Or we don't hear much about how it continued with Black Lives Matter and how they now survive in the more harsh conditions. Can you say something about that?
Well, I mean, as in many places, there have been enormous demonstrations in support of the people of Palestine and the situation in Gaza in particular. And what may surprise you is that those crowds overlap significantly with the crowds that came out during the American summer of 2020. And I know this is true because when I was having some medical treatment in my clinic, I met a photographer. He was having the same treatment I was having. Black Jamaican heritage photographer. His name is Wayne Campbell. He calls himself WACFO, W-A-C-F-O-O, WACFO. And he has dedicated the last few years to cataloguing the resistance on the street around Black Lives Matter in London. And you can look at the books he's made. He makes books himself. He doesn't get a big publisher to do it. He makes these beautiful photographic volumes. He has if anyone comes to London, Brixton Market, he has a small shop there where he sells these photographic gems he's produced. And having produced 2 editions of the book that chronicles the resistance around Black Lives Matter, he's also spent the last 2 years chronicling the street-level resistance that governs solidarity with the people of Gaza. And I haven't been on many of those demonstrations. I think I've been on a couple. There are reasons for that I can go into. I don't really want to talk about really now. But they are, when I first went there, I would say, and Bron can correct me if this is wrong, but my impression was that probably 80% of the people on the demonstrations in the beginning were black people, brown people, a lot of African people, Caribbean people. People, of course, obviously being Muslim isn't color-coded, so there's a whole set of questions about that. And, we forget sometimes how widely Arabic is spoken in Africa. So there are all kinds of questions that arise that would help us to understand the overlap between the form of resistance that appears in the street around the Black Lives Matter moment, the Black Lives Matter history, and the history of the last 2 years. And so I would, if you want to verify that, I would really recommend looking at the work that Wayne Wakfu Campbell has produced, which is amazing. Is amazing work. And I know he's been in the West Bank recently, taking photographs there. I don't know what he's going to do next, but he's not untypical, actually, of the way people have found the history of suffering in one situation to be something that can resonate with a different history of suffering. I think that happens.
Thank you very much. Thank you both for the framing and this conversation. I wanted to ask something. Maybe there is not an answer. I've been trying to reflect on that, but I haven't reached one yet. Maybe you can help. I really value your explorations on this, like, let's say, suppressed history of frictions, but also cultural syncretism. And also how what you mentioned before, nationality still is linked to ethnicity. And but regarding how to deal with heritage or what we inherit from the past and your conversation in history, so I've been like struggling with some sort of paradox that is a result of Avery Gordon's notion of ghostly matters. So, of course, ghosts or this sort of haunting might trigger like subversive phenomenon and social progress. But at the same time, I wonder if this haunting is also something that forecloses political imagination. So I would like to, especially regarding identity politics, how it has been captured somehow, or simplified, let's say. So I would like to ask how to overcome this national, ethnic, like, bind, but at the same time trying to produce a new imagination or a new political imagination. Yeah, thank you.
Well, again, I pretend to know the answer to that question, but you at the end, you talked about imagination. And I think imagination is something that is important to cultivate, actually. It's like, a muscle or something. You have to work on your imagination. And I think that the technological environment that we inhabit is not conducive to that relationship with our own imaginations. And that's why I, jokingly said that people should get off their phones, because I think that the transformation of time, you need to have time to be imaginative. Maybe you even need to be bored to find the thread of creativity. So I think, where you ended up, in a way you answered your own question by turning to the issue of imagination. I'm not saying ghosts aren't important, because obviously in the tradition of African descended folks that we share, we have duppies. And I know that this has been an issue for Steve in some of his other work on the Caribbean, question of duppies and who's haunted in the past. And of course, the figure of the zombie comes from the Caribbean into the culture of the whole world, the Western world anyway. And the zombie's a very interesting kind of figure, because most ghosts in Western traditions, are like an entity without a body, or consciousness without a body. But what you have with the zombie is the opposite of that. You have a body without the consciousness. And I would say that is to do with the history of enslavement that produces this figure of the body without a consciousness. It's a fantasy that comes from that history, even if it's not always recognized as belonging to that history. So as I walk with many duppies now, particularly as I've got older, I see lots of ghosts everywhere I go. And I grieve for those people, if they were friends. I think that imagination is the key to all of this. And that's why I'm glad to be out of the university. Because where I was working in the university, it wasn't an environment in which people were being encouraged to be imaginative, or encouraged to be curious. And the sorts of struggles that are going on now with regard to the student getting AI to write their essays for them and all this kind of stuff. That's just that the power of imagination is dwindling, not growing in those places. So it's great to be in the cinema talking about ideas. Last week I was in a jazz club in Brussels talking about ideas. It's great. Let 10,000 flowers bloom. Let's go and take these conversations out from behind the walls of the university, which is I love libraries, don't get me wrong. I love libraries, I love books, you know. But let's take these conversations into other places. And, you know, you'll see in the film, if I may get back to the film again, you'll see that there are a number of people in the film that we could call intellectuals, but they're not academics. They're different. They're people who may be unschooled intellectuals, or people who taught themselves. One person in the film, and this isn't a spoiler actually, is the great Trinidadian writer C.L.R. James, who wrote the book called The Black Jacobins in 1938. It's a history of the Haitian Revolution. And James, I don't think James ever went to college anywhere. I mean, I know the kind of schooling that they gave him in Trinidad probably is equivalent to advanced training, you know, these days. But he never went to university. He went into.
And I'm very honored, I mean, to be present with you both because I adore both of your works. I have a question who may be a little bit personal, but what does it do to you to see all of these ghosts and to work with questions who are, I would say, difficult questions? Yeah, my question is more about embodiment and the effect of working with the ghost or being the one who sees the ghost.
Well, I don't think I'm the only one who sees them, actually.
No, I know.
I think that's a good thing, in a way, because, you know, everyone's got their own ghosts. The duppies that they walk with are there. So maybe it's more of a human problem. I mean, you seem to be suggesting there was a kind of cost to seeing these forces alive in the world. Is that what you meant?
Yes. Because I work on Swiss coloniality, and it's a ghost that a lot of people refuse to see.
Sure.
So I'm talking about that ghost.
Okay. Well, the frustration then, it comes not so much from your relationship with the ghost. It comes from the inability or the difficulty, let's say, in making other people who ought to be able to see it, making it come to life for them. Mm-hmm. And that is very hard, very debilitating work. And that's why I would say that I'm really, really grateful to Steve McQueen, because what he has done with these films is to make it so much harder to get into that posture of denial and closure, which doesn't admit that history. And I know he worked really hard for a long, long time to bring that possibility together and to bring that history alive in the world. And, you know, I mean, who knows what the consequences... This is only a few years now. We don't know what the consequences of all of this is going to be in the future. So it's exhilarating and exciting to know that somebody can take on that kind of mission, and it's very, very typical of him in many of the different interventions he's made, both as an artist and as a filmmaker, actually, to try and invest that history with a new vitality that can communicate across the generations, across the geography, across the planet, to bring that story and make it part of the history of the world, actually. So I think we should follow, in that sense, follow some of his boldness as an example. I mean, he would be horrified if he heard me saying this. Let me just say it privately to you. But that is actually what I think, and that's one of the reasons I've enjoyed working with him on a few different things, because he's a fearless character.
Thank you.
So, okay, one more question, and then we round up.
I can't seem to get this idea of intellectuals and academics, if one could be either or, both and. But then my question to you would come back to being outside the walls of academia, and where your imagination has led you now. You talked about this project on chocolate capitals of the world. It was?
I'm not going on the chocolate. That was just because I was in Brussels.
I took you too seriously then.
Somebody should do that.
So are you working on anything at the moment?
I actually want to talk about it's not good to talk about work until you've got it in the world. It's not conducive to good work to do that. Yeah, sorry. I mean, when you said about intellectuals going out for the I mean, we have an incredible technological infrastructure which enables the currency of ideas to to be fertile in all kinds of places, and we have to work with that ecology of culture, of ideas, of imagination. We have to really do that because the technological things which are beginning to happen won't require us anymore. They'll have, I mean, it's already happened. I don't know if you've been looking at the poetry that people have been getting out of AI machines, or the paintings, or some of the music that AI is making. I mean, I'm worried about this boundary around the human because I think I see a threat from that direction also. And maybe it sounds, sounds like I'm being some sort of bored old guy who's worried about the future, but I actually am. I think that the things that we prize, the things we value, the cultures that we've made, often against in the most difficult of circumstances, all of this can be swept away in a minute by these characters, these sort of Silicon Valley type people who've monetized the destruction of all of those things. So it's a very serious question about the human, because maybe it's not enough to fight with that particular tool in your hand. Maybe we need some new tools, but that is going to be the issue. And maybe a lot of people won't know the difference. They won't know the difference between a poem or a song or a painting that's generated by AI because they'll be so worried about surviving that they won't get to the point where that kind of critical problem is going to be meaningful to them. So we have to fight on their behalf too, to hold on to. It sounds very conservative to say this. I don't think it's so. But in our country at least, the left isn't interested in culture. Not that there's much of a left, but they're not interested in culture. Never have been. So we have to fight for that. We have to fight for the imagination. We have to fight for art. We have to fight for poetry. We have to fight for music. We have to. I mean, and these are not abstract questions. You look. I don't know how it is in Switzerland with education, or let's say musical education in schools. The way that's been changed. But when my kids were little, they could go to a local program in music, and they could learn an instrument, and they could play in an orchestra, and all of that kind of thing. And that was just there in our community, and we didn't pay. Well, we paid for it in our taxes, but we're not buying that from the local state. That's just part of what education might mean. And all of those things have been lost and swept away, I would say now, because they become a kind of luxury item. If you want your child not to be shouted at, if you want your child to be able to play music or learn art or whatever, you have to. We're told now the market is the answer, and that is a loss. That's a loss, really. I mean, maybe it doesn't appear here in the way it does in England, where we've been, everything's been cut to the bone and beyond. But that's a real question. It's a practical issue. It's not some airy-fairy thing. It's a practical political question. How do you secure the kind of education? Well, it's partly, I suppose, I'm saying this because my mum is a teacher, like some of the people in the education film. I don't know if you're going to get to see the education film at some point, but people like that. I mean, Steve was very kind to write a sentence on the back of. My sister got my mother's autobiography republished recently, and Steve gave a kind of shove to it to get it back into the bookshops, which is really appreciated. So I think, I believe in education, and I believe in free education being high quality education. And there's lots of things that we can do, as were done in the past by an earlier generation of settlers, who gave their children what they call supplementary education. Education that was not habituated to the expectations of white supremacy, education that was slow if it needed to be slow, education that was rich and not boiled down to its minimal components. So I think these are practical questions, and what the technological base of this reformed relationship with education is going to be, I don't know about that, but I do think it's probably got to be slow. I think it's probably got to be slower, because I think these technologies are constantly there's part of a kind of acceleration. I mean, you know, years ago we used to talk about slow food, didn't we? I sort of think that I remember going, when we were still working at Yale, going to hear José Bové talk. I'm sure people know José Bové. This was shortly after he'd been arraigned before the court for setting fire to McDonald's. He was, at that time, he was a maker of Roquefort. He made sheep's cheese. Yeah, do you remember him? And he was also very involved in the struggles of people who came out of the water, crossing over from Italy into France, and he got into another set of. But he was a farmer anyway. Why am I saying this? Because he talked a lot about slow food. And I was sitting there in the seminar listening to him talk about slow food and thinking, maybe this question of lenteur has a different resonance in other areas of life. So, you know, I'm still trying to find lenteur.
So, take things slow and fight for the imagination. So on that note, would like to thank you so very much, Paul. It's been an honor having this conversation with you, and to all of you for your time this evening. We're very, very thankful to have you with us.
Thank you, and do enjoy the film, won't you? It's really